Yay. Okay, so hi, my name is Andreas Unteidig. I'm with the Design Research Lab here at the Berlin University of the Art, and we very broadly ask how processes of digitalization affect socio-political processes and which roles the design of technologies plays or can play in these processes. We're about 25 researchers, and we're engaged in a wide range of projects that deal with possible futures in human technology interaction around different sets of questions, like how tech becomes more ubiquitous and part of our surrounding, like in clothing, what we could learn from applying design to needs such as long-distance communication for deafblind people, how we could interact with technological devices in different ways, apart from swiping and clicking, and how technology and digital tools can help facilitate and foster accessibility and inclusion.
Yeah, my name is Clausen, and we'll try to explain later how we come together, because I'm working in a completely different field. As you see, it's a garden. I'm a co-founder of a place called Prinzessengarten. Some of you might know it. It's pretty close to here, also in Kreuzberg. It's a roughly 6,000 square meter urban garden project. We transformed urban vacant land into this community garden. I should just show you this picture. This is what was originally planned in Kreuzberg, a huge motorway crossing through one of the densest neighborhoods in the city. And the garden is just an example how a failed planning, in this case transforming the whole urban landscape to make it fit for car transportation, how this failed planning allowed this kind of unused spaces to be taken over by initiatives like Prinzessengarten. We turned it, as I said, into an urban garden, which is also a place to discuss questions of, for example, our food system, and questions also related to space. It's a highly contested area in Kreuzberg today, and we try to not just concentrate on practically gardening, but also trying to open our activities to question how does the garden relate to the city, how does the city relate to the countryside. And for this we created a project called the Neighborhood Academy, which is an open platform for using social and cultural exchange, and we're asking questions of how do we want to live in the city tomorrow, especially facing multiple crises: political, social crisis of inequality, crisis of access, for example with the refugee crisis, but also ecological crisis. And we're trying to discuss possible alternatives and do this on a more discursive or artistic level, but we'll also do it practically. This is an example of a building we're building right now as a DIY process with a lot of volunteers. It's called the Laube, the Aber, and it is also meant as a practice of commoning. So how can we share spaces for the common good?
So Marco's engaged in all kinds of critical urban practices, while we are coming more from the technology development side. And now we work together, we stand here together, and the question is, of course, why we're here, or what brings us together. And the most obvious thing, or the first obvious thing, is, of course, that both of these spheres, the urban and the digital, or technology, are more and more becoming affected by tendencies of enclosure, of monopolization, and structured by commercial trajectories. And in both spheres, a dominance of market-driven developments are enclosing the range of possibilities and the range of possible futures that we have in the spheres towards or in favor of a more centralized and homogeneous models. And of course, we all know this from the digital space. where technology is on the one hand increasingly becoming the prioritized access for us to the world, to our subjectivities, to the ways we see ourselves and what we can do and what we can't do. And at the same time, the ways in which we most of us use technology to interact with one another, to get information, or to perform almost any other activity is more and more becoming pre-structured and predetermined, put into boxes by a handful of players.
So as I said, a garden is not just a place to garden, but by doing so in an organic way within a community, you also start to ask questions related to our food system, which is usually not very diverse and not very community-based. And how would a picture like this relate to a conference like the Republica? And I'm not talking about GPS and tractors. I talk about a general tendency of global players taking over huge fields of what our daily need, be it food, be it digital devices, and form them in a way that they make a lot of profit from it, and or take all the data or use it for political purposes. So when we talk about formulating alternatives to monopolization or to monocultures, it's also about stressing diversity, not just as an aesthetical idea, but just when I stick to the example of industrialized food systems, when we produce food like this, it's extremely functional and efficient on the one hand, if you look at the numbers. But of course, what we don't see is what's being destroyed by doing this. And what's being destroyed is, for example, the diversity of seeds and plants and ecosystems. And in times of change, like climate change, we heavily rely on diversity, because diversity is also for us an option to adapt to change. So this is why in the different fields we're talking about, it's crucial, from my understanding, that we not just depend completely on heavily monopolized industrialized systems, but that we start to create spaces for diversity and alternatives. So it's just a difference between this probably shot in Brazil monocultures to grow corn for our hunger for meat, and this is an example of a community garden right here at Tempelhof Airfield, where a lot of different people from different communities grow their own food.
So of course there are many alternative practices and approaches around in both spheres, and many have been along for a very long time, and others are just emerging. In regards to digital spaces, it's places like this where we can see this very lively, where veterans of net politics come together with newcomers that build on this vast pools of knowledge and adapt it to new technologies to solve new issues. And we heard a lot of many good examples from civic tech, from citizen-driven smart projects like in Barcelona, on new approaches to the digital commons.
So one of the main, we started in 2009 with Prinzessinnengarten. In 2009, Berlin was a city with a lot of vacant land where nobody really knew what to do with it. And there was a global financial crisis, and it looked like that nothing much will happen. So we used open spaces for a garden, other people did it for cultural purposes and so on. But of course, the situation changed rapidly and radically. So the financialization of space became one of the main issues that we're confronted with in our everyday life, usually refer to this process as gentrification. And in this situation, we see a lot of people organizing around these issues, and they of course protest because they're affected immediately by being pushed out of their houses and their workspaces and so on. But what they also do is creating spaces to come together to share knowledge and to negotiate how to act. So, and this is an example, this is the Laube in an installation or in an event organized by Michel Thérain about reclaiming, where we gather different political or city or urban political movements to display what their demands are. And of course, the street still is a very important place to gather. For us as Neighborhood Academy, we see in this people being on the street not just a form of resistance, not just a protest, not just being against something. It's also this, but it's also often a process of what we call collective learning. So when we go to the street, when we go to the Gece Kondu of Coty & Co. at Cottbusser, we meet people that are affected by the same things, but we discuss, we learn how things happen, how one can organize, how one can express also alternatives to what's going on.
So for us, it's quite. It makes a lot of sense to merge these two perspectives from the urban struggles with those of the digital sphere. Not only because the logics of enclosure or the forms of resistance are quite similar and also interwoven, but also when we look at how technology is more and more structuring our lives, it's of course also structuring the way we approach urban space, the way we navigate and move through cities, but maybe more importantly, the way we collectively produce cities, produce the urban space by our collective social practice.
And speaking about the relation of the digital and the urban, of course we see things like the smart city, where it's about infrastructures that are helping us or controlling our everyday lives. But we also see that the tech companies more and more also become a physical player in the urban landscape. So right now, for example, of course everybody heard what happened in San Francisco with real estate prices and rents after the boom in the Silicon Valley. Right now we have the same situation in Kreuzberg with big companies like Google or Zalando using their extreme economic power to move into communities and to decide how these communities will look like in the future. It's just a rendering of the building that Zalando is planning to build and move into, and it's on a very contested space with a high symbolic meaning for the community. So we see that, and it's not being against tech or it's not being against business, but with this market power, and there's no way that the community has a role in defining how these places should look like. And it's, of course, dramatically making it harder for people to find spaces for their own businesses, for their own community places, and so on. So again, it's about the monopolization and enclosures on the one side, and a democratic fight for access and diversity on the other. So, of course, these processes go on, and they are quite strong, also often very hard in their effects on people, and not just people with low income, but also a lot of businesses right now in Kreuzberg. The question is how to answer. And one answer, or one important nucleus for an answer, is self-organized open spaces, to my opinion. So how can we create spaces that are open for everyone, be it physical or be it digital, and try to find a bottom-up answer to these top-down strategies? So when it comes to the project we're doing together, this is something like the starting point or the original question. If this is the process, if we're witnessing a process of a merging of the physical and the digital, and it's by now mainly driven by top-down projects, could it be possible to answer to articulate an alternative from the bottom up, from the community? So in Mozzie we're testing, and Andreas will tell you more about the idea if we as grassroots initiative can use technology for what we're doing, to organize, to articulate what our struggle is about, but we're also asking at the same time, can we as communities or as initiatives try to teach designers, tech developers, to include ideas that are important for us, specifically ideas about the commons and accessibility.
Yeah, so Mozzie is the project that that we're doing together with many other people. It means together in Greek. It's a EU-funded project in the CAPS framework. It runs for 3 years, and it has 9 European partners. Generally, it's a tech project, ICT project, because it's funded through an ICT scheme, and we're also focusing on networking technology. But in that, it's quite an odd child, as it's not about the development of a particular piece of technology, but more about the conditions or the ecosystems that makes it more likely for others to develop their own stuff, to develop their own approaches to network technology in a DIY manner. Real quick, what do I mean by DIY networking? In general, self-made, collectively owned network infrastructure, which is possible for us to appropriate for the things we want to use it for, without necessarily having to adhere to the logics, rules, playbooks of big commercial providers. Many of the things we experiment with are offline networks, meaning that we don't connect to the internet through them, but they dispense a Wi-Fi and we use it to connect with each other in physical proximity. So this is an example of that's actually the site of the Prinzessinnengarten, where we install these networks for the people at the Laube to interconnect with each other and to use applications that run there locally. With this, of course, we build on many good examples of that. I mean, there's a massive amount of great work done in different scales, like Adam Barthol's Dead Drops, or the Pirate Box by David Darts, Occupy Here, or here in Berlin, the work of Wachter and Jud, here with Callnet, or bigger networks, of course, like Freifunk, or the Athens Metropolitan Wireless Network, which consists now of, I think, over 30,000 nodes that are collectively owned. So there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of open source material available for us, but the problem is that this is still very much connected to the nimbus of hackertum and geekness. So it's very hard for people that are not particularly tech savvy to engage this, to demystify it, and to break it open and make it their own. So the goal of the project is to design a toolkit, which is this thing right now, which consists of low-cost off-the-shelf hardware, like a Raspberry Pi and a battery, for which we either design or migrate open-source software, and then deploy it as a downloadable image, for instance, for those that just want to download it, put it on an SD card, put it in, switch it on, and it works. But of course, it's also open for others to change it, to appropriate it, to make it something else. But in short, we're aiming at enabling the greatest amount of possible amount of people to build and to appropriate this network technology for themselves as with a DIY approach. For the design of this toolkit, of course, we didn't want to sit in some laboratory and design a toolkit, but we wanted to generate practical knowledge out of different contexts, for which we engaged, or for which we designed these 4 pilot studies, out of which this gets generated. They're in different European cities. Usually it's a pair of one design or tech institution, mostly university, which partners up with a local community. And these communities include neighborhood associations, right to the city activists, housing cooperatives, and art collectives. So each of these community partners, so to say, are in different ways already posing questions of how we want to live as societies in the futures. And we want to take this questioning, this query, as the departure point of developing technology, instead of focusing on a market niche that we want to fill with the stuff, or some particular problem that we want to solve.
So we don't have so much time left. So shortly, there's different pilots. Berlin and the Neighborhood Academy is one. Our initial thought was there's a fertile ground in Berlin for a lot of initiatives that are engaged in the fight for creating commons or the right to the city. The idea of the Neighborhood Academy is to also bring these different initiatives together, and maybe also include cross-sectional forms of cooperation with engineers or researchers. And we wanted to apply the logic of what we're doing, for example, in the garden and other places of commoning, which is to not just be mere consumers, to not just to 100% rely on systems that we cannot control and that we don't understand, but that we instead become co-producers or co-designers of such technologies. So, and the question we're posing is, will the design change when this is the process, when designers and community activists work together? So can we make sure that in the design and the technology itself, some of the ideas that are important for us, community control, accessibility, also that these technologies cannot be commercialized so easily, that these aspects become part of the thing. And the thing we're talking about, as you see, also doesn't look so frightening. It's just hanging there in a plastic bag. And of course, like in the garden, it's also about demystification of things. And that is also very important for accessibility. So we're just practically thinking about using the Mozzie as the idea of having your own intranet in an open space is already intriguing, but then you have to put it to practical use, and we're thinking of using it as an archive for all the different activities, so people can come and see what we're doing and what we did in the past. We want to use it as a tool to manage spatial commons like the Laube. And we're also thinking about using it for like democratic participation process, especially when it comes to decisions on the piece of land that we're right now working on and that is highly contested.
So this is one of these pilots. Others focus more on civic tech perspectives, for instance. But the idea is that we engage in these processes to collaboratively build networks in the particular context of these pilots, and then to learn from that practice and to transfer element of these practices, be it software or discourses or conflicts or any other learnings that we had, into the design of this piece of technology that we want to then put out as infrastructure. Yeah, so we want to learn from these pilots to make it possible to create something that helps others to think the logics that we know from the internet, like Wi-Fi, social networking, online collaborative tools, and so on, as something that can be built by oneself, owned by oneself, and also operated locally. So right now it's a work in progress. We are by default hosting a couple of custom-built applications, like the one Marco just showed. And some open source applications like Etherpads, like Nextcloud or WordPress to host a website locally. It's got a dashboard for users to adapt it and to, for instance, decide on basic settings like SSID names, or whether you want it to be providing internet or just operate locally. And we're very open for any collaboration, so all of the stuff is on GitHub, and if you feel like this is something you're interested in, please check it out.
So for us, this is an experiment, like a lot of things we're doing, and it's we're posing the question: how much control can we have as community or as politically organized initiatives of the resources we need? Be it the food that we eat, be it the spatial landscape of our city, and also the next step here is the digital infrastructure. And for us, it's important to understand these as processes of commoning. So it's not just of using, and commoning is also not just of access for everyone. I mean, access for everyone you can have with Google and Facebook. But it's about who is controlling the infrastructure and who has got the benefit. So it always comes with the question of ownership. And it's also not just about sharing. With sharing, you know this from platforms like Uber or Airbnb, sharing also just means some few who own privately the platform have a lot of control, and they're also having an extremely negative impact on cities like Berlin. So for us, commoning is about collective ownership for the common good. It's about democratic decision making. It's about preventing things from being commodified and commercialized. And it's about us being in the driver's seat as a community. So what we don't or what we cannot do is replacing the internet, but we might pick up with some of the utopias of the internet, of freedom, diversity, and so on, and try to implement them on a micro scale in places like the Neighborhood Academy and others. So that's the basic story.
Pretty much it.
That's pretty much it.
Thank you. I like your time management. Do we have questions?
Wow.
1, 2, yes.
Is the technology that you're using, this is all open source, is it also, it's on GitHub and also the hardware parts?
It's a Raspberry Pi.
It's all described, so other communities could copy this idea and use it in practice for other purposes.
Absolutely, that's the idea. Yeah. I mean, the hardware right now is a Raspberry Pi. This is not something we developed, but that's an open hardware that's available. You can buy it for like, I think 30 or 35 euros. Download the image, and then you can customize it or change it as you want. All the software components, also the 3D printing files and all that stuff is all on GitHub. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Chris. I'm also coming from the design field, but actually very interested in commenting eco-social progress and so on, and in how far it is changing what designers do. I think it's on one hand, yes, the openness of the things we design, but on the other hand, eventually even the processes and how we approach the co-design process with the people who will use this. And what is your experience with this, particularly in the garden project, where you might even encounter a lot of people who actually say, hey, who cares? I don't care about technology and so on. Are there any issues or conflicts about it, or how do you manage this process?
As a designer?
I think in our particular project right now, it's a very oscillating process of like in and out. So there's a core team of people from our place and people from the Neighborhood Academy and some other initiatives in Berlin that come together regularly, and you know, there's decisions to be made, but we try to open the process as often as we can, for instance, for stakeholders from other initiatives, for users of the Laube, in order to, you know, to discuss things, build concepts, get ideas. But then I think it's important always to move back and build something out of these ideas, to have something tangible that you can throw back in order to have something on the table that you can talk about. So it's like a, you know, we follow like a designer's infrastructuring approach. So it's not about seeing a problem, analyzing it, and designing a solution for it, because that's of course fairly impossible in this case. So it's more about a process, and also designing the props for others to take part in this process, so that we become part of these processes become part of ours, and that's the challenge. And there's of course contradictions and conflicts and dead ends, but that's something we focus on, that we also take as focus of our research.